What are the negatives and positives you see on social media?
Like if you put people who hate each other distance one away from each other, and like you have this, like one big room with 100 million people shouting, like people don't just like hear the opposing side and think like, that's a good argument, right?
After the Kremlin launched their invasion against Ukraine in 2022, you very quickly condemned the attack.
Like I definitely felt like I had a need to just, like make it very clear how I feel about the about the whole situation. Is Putin killing tens of thousands of people in Mariupol, like against those values, or kind of like something that's like, oh no, totally perpendicular, totally neutral to those values? Like, well, no, it's like completely against.
There has been some gloomy predictions about AI and how it could do a lot of destruction.
AI is just like it's just on another level, right? Like one of the constraints on dictators historically has been that like eventually if they do things that are too horrible, their own people start turning against them, right? With AIs, like basically, if your soldiers are robots, then like they're not going to do that. It has unlimited power and unlimited attention.
Welcome to Soup Talk. Technologies like cryptocurrencies, decentralization, and AI are rapidly changing our society, and many, including me, are having hard time keeping up with the latest developments. Which is why I decided to have a chat with Vitalik Buterin, the co-founder of Ethereum. Among other topics, we discussed about technology, social media, and the war in Ukraine. Hope you enjoy it.
Could you briefly introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do? What's your favorite soup? And so on.
Sure. So I'm Vitalik Buterin. I think most people who know me as the founder of the Ethereum project, which is one of the larger blockchain projects out there. And in addition to that, I've also been involved in some other things. Like I've contributed a lot to the longevity space and biotech, and like I have a blog where I talk about all kinds of different things. So I do a lot, but like mostly like blockchains and cryptography. And my favorite soup, I think miso soup.
Miso soup. All right, that's interesting. That's the first miso soup we get. But you also used to play video games, no? So what's your all-time favorite video game, and why?
So when I was a teenager, there's basically two kinds of games that I would play. So one of them is World of Warcraft, and the other is I would code games myself, and then I would play them until I get bored, and then I would make myself another game. So this was basically actually how I started learning programming. Like I basically started like making a clone of Space Invaders, and then playing that, and then eventually like making role-playing games and RTSs, and just playing them myself. So I did that quite a bit, and then World of Warcraft, I was in it basically from close to the beginning all the way up until around like halfway through Wrath of the Lich King or so. So yeah, I don't know, those were both definitely important parts of my upbringing.
Okay, I think one of your blog posts you said that World of Warcraft actually was the reason why you started disliking centralized systems. Is this how much truth there is to this?
I mean, it is true that I was like super upset at World of Warcraft when they nerfed my Warlock, but the fact that like that was the thing that made me a little interested in decentralization was definitely a bit of a joke.
All right. But I think you've sometimes referred yourself as a digital nomad. So you go around the world and you don't really have a place where you stay for a longer period of time. What's your all-time favorite location to hang out, and why?
I think just going through the list, Buenos Aires, I've been is one of them. I've been there recently, a couple of times over the last couple of years. It's both just very good as a city, like it's the sort of place that any person would really enjoy living in, and also it has this like actually very strong crypto community there, because they have the ongoing inflation problems, they have these challenges in being connected to the international economy, so there's like a lot of people who really believe in crypto and are like really actually building a lot of high quality things out of there. So that would be one. Then in the US, I think my two favorites are, one is the Bay Area. It just has a super high concentration of just all kinds of interesting people with interesting ideas. Another would probably be Denver. Denver is, I think, actually Ethereum's capital in America. It's kind of interesting. Like one of our major researchers, quite a few of our teams and even Ethereum projects, Gitcoin, some others, they live there. It's this like really fascinating culture that I respect, and it values a lot of the things that we value. Values freedom and values equality. It values self-organization. It values just like people trying to improve the world and being kind to each other. And but in a way that's kind of more sane than I guess some of the more extreme places. In Europe, I think London is up there. It's also got that like really high concentration of interesting people. Also Berlin. Like if you walk through Berlin, like you probably need to know some German to like pick this up fully. But if you just like look at the graffiti and the posters, there's just like all kinds of like really fascinating political messaging there that you just see pretty much every kilometer. Like there's this one poster I saw that showed like a burned pizza, and the cheese on the pizza was shaped like a map of the world, and it said like do not overstep the goal of 180 degrees. So it was like making a joke about climate change basically, and like how hopeless we are, but doing it in this really fun way. In Asia, I think Taipei is up there. One of the things I love about the culture in Taiwan is that there's like people are really eager to learn, and people are really eager to self-organize, right? So one of the things that I would see there is like I would often write a blog post and like talking about some advanced cryptography, like some zk snark thing, possibly something else, and I would find out that like there's just a group of people there that came together and copy pasted the blog post into a Google Doc and are all just annotating it and helping each other like learn and understand what I'm talking about, and like that spirit really impresses me. Then think Thailand has like one of those places where there's a lot of different cultures come together. I think Singapore has that too. Dubai also has that too. So I think like many different countries are interesting in their own ways. I mean, I find something to really respect in a lot of them.
All right. You're one of the co-founders of the extremely popular Ethereum, no?
Mm-hmm.
How has this project changed your life?
I mean, it basically has been my life for the past 10 years, right? So the way that this started was, so I got into Bitcoin back in 2011, and at first I actually came in as a writer. So I started writing first for some Bitcoin blogs, then for a Bitcoin magazine, which was this Bitcoin print magazine started by this Romanian guy named Mihai Alicia, and he just randomly emailed me and he just said, hey, I want to start a Bitcoin magazine. Do you want to be a writer? And I said, sure. Then at some point I decided I wanted to really start getting into the space more full time. And first, actually, I tried to work for Ripple briefly, but then there were like US visa issues, like basically, the kind of visas that I needed to use required the company to have existed for a year, but it only existed for 9 months. And so that ended up falling through. And so I basically had this off term in university, and I used that to join the first I went to New Hampshire to see the libertarian Bitcoiners there. Then I went to Europe, worked with Mihai, and then that one term extended into like 2 terms. I basically went on this trip around the Bitcoin world, interviewing and exploring all the different communities, writing articles about all of them. And eventually I started talking to these people called, one of the projects was called Colored Coins, one was called Mastercoin. Like the basic idea of them was that they were trying to use blockchains as a technology to do things that go beyond Bitcoin, the currency. And I got really interested in them, and I started working for these projects and thinking about how to help them become even more powerful. And then at some point I got this idea of like, let's basically putting a general purpose programming language into one of these platforms. And these guys basically said, this is interesting, but, we don't want to do this yet. We still have a lot of things in our roadmap. And so I basically decided, okay, fine, I'll do it myself. So that's how Ethereum started. And then Ethereum ended up basically turning my, what was initially a 4-month university break and became a 1-year university break into a permanent university break. And then because I was already jumping between different cities doing my like Bitcoin journalist tour, that kind of smoothly slid into like presenting about Ethereum at various conferences. And I was sort of the person already on the road, and I was the person who would just say yes to these things. And so I kind of slipped into being a permanent nomad. Then, it's really definitely taught me a lot. It's definitely gotten me to know a lot of interesting people. Not even just in the blockchain space, but also like people working on like biotech, AI, other forms of cryptography, economics, politics, just all kinds of really fascinating people.
But there's also a dark side to cryptocurrencies, and it's common. Like I think that this is like a if you ask any common folk on the street, a lot of people may say, "Isn't it that used for drugs or weapons or for crime?" And we even have a case where politicians have been paid in crypto by foreign agents. Are there any effective ways today to prevent this type of activity, or how should this problem be addressed in your view?
I think, a couple of answers, right? So one of them is like, there are the high profile stories, right? But at the same time, like there have been actual reports that try to look at like crypto crime activity as a percentage of crypto activity. And they've actually found that it's like not significantly higher than I think the US dollar. Like, I think, I forget which company it was that made a report, but like they're pretty easy to find on the internet. So, like that's one part, right? Which is that I think, like those issues do get exaggerated, and like the aspects of it where like people really benefit because they're in some country where they just like don't have access to global financial systems at all, and like crypto just helps them like quietly save money. Like they have no incentive to talk about that, right? So I think that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer for me is that I think there's like definitely not all, but a big portion of the bad things that happen in the crypto space actually can be addressed with better crypto technology. So one example of this is like a lot of the time, the big thing that people complain about is like the thefts, right? So like you have, like exchanges getting hacked, applications getting hacked, and then you have a bunch of money, and then that money also gets used to fund bad people. And one of the most powerful ways to fix that is to like actually, work on improving security, right? And like 10 years ago, it was actually pretty terrible, right? Like you probably, remember Mt. Gox and like when that big exchange collapsed, and that was definitely a few percent of all, like it was lost like 600,000 Bitcoins. So like 3% of the current supply and like 6% of the supply at the time, right? Like it was bad. And I think as a percentage of the ecosystem, the rate at which those things happen definitely decreases. And then since then, we've actually switched from or at least partially, from these centralized platforms where you have to like trust one person, and the one person, if the one person does something wrong, then like all the money is gone, to trusting these like more decentralized applications where you have like actual code that's on a blockchain, and people can look at it, people can see what the logic is, people can make sure that it's doing the right thing. And like it's not perfect because there's always a risk it has a bug and like somebody catches the bug, but I think if you just look at the space overall, like the really worst things that happened, they've basically happened because actually, like people within crypto ended up like trusting basically centralized actors who really end up not being trustworthy, right? So like first Mark Karpellas, then like Sam Bankman-Fried about a year ago, and so on. And so that's one example. I think there's another really interesting set of examples is zero knowledge proof technology, which I think is really valuable to start for people to really know about, because it actually has applications that go far beyond the blockchain space. So, like one concrete example, right? So there's one of the things that you could use them for zero knowledge proofs for is privacy, right? So what zero knowledge proofs do is they let you prove information about yourself without revealing anything else about who you are, right? So like there's literally an application where like you can prove that you're a citizen of some country without revealing your name to anyone. And so at first, these were starting to get used in the crypto space for like privacy protocols, right? Because like by default, everything on a blockchain is public, and so it's like actually, a gold mine for law enforcement. I think a lot of people even think a little bit too much of one, right? Because like that's like having all the data be public is like not how anything else works. And people basically started creating these protocols where to spend a coin, you don't have to like point to the specific previous coin that you had. You have to like just make one of these proofs that proves that like you have some coin somewhere and you spent it and you can't spend it again. And these things started getting used by like bad people to some extent, right? So there's like criminals, like some North Korean groups and so on. And what's happened since then is we've seen people working on a second generation of privacy protocols. And the privacy protocol there, like the content of the proof basically says, instead of saying, I have a coin and I'm spending it, it basically says, I have a coin and my coin is not one of these coins that have been recognized as being like a hacked smart contract or like stolen money, one of these bad things, and I haven't spent it. So you basically have a privacy protocol that could give like basically privacy to like regular people, but at the same time, it's like actually excluding all of the known bad actors, right? And it's like doing that without actually like having any kind of central data collection. So I think like these kinds of ideas, like they're useful in the crypto space, but I think they're also useful like even for a lot of other applications going far beyond, right? Like in the context of social media, for example, right? I think there's been this really, if like long on kind of tension where, like on the one side, there's this belief that on the internet, you have freedom because on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, right? So like really trying to, like emphasize the anonymity side of things. And then there's the other side of it that basically says that like, like if you're anonymous, then like basically nobody can trust what you're saying and, like you might be some bad person and so on, right? And what we, with like zero knowledge proofs, what we actually have is we have a way of like even getting some of the best of both worlds, right? So you could basically prove things about your own reputation, about your own history. You could even make a system that like proves that you have not taken any actions like with that same account that like violated some policies or whatever. And so you can actually like preserve a high amount of privacy and at the same time do that in a way that proves that you're not a bad actor, right? So there's like these really fascinating technologies that are being like really incubated within the crypto space that like I actually think can really expand the space of what we can do on the internet and at the same time make things a lot more trustworthy.
Okay. You're one of the biggest holders of Ether. Ether is the currency, right? What's your relation to money in general? How do you see wealth?
Oh, I think, to me, like one of the, like probably the most valuable thing about money is basically not having to worry about money, right? It's like I'm definitely not the sort of person that cares about, mansions and private jets and like $1 million cars and any of that stuff. My life is like not, aside from the whole nomad bit, like not that different from yours. So I think it's it's a tool, and the things that like I use money for is like mostly just like supporting like people and projects that I find valuable that I think are doing important work.
Okay. It seems like there is kind of a trend right now going on. among celebrities that they're creating their own like kind of meme coins or shit coins or whatever we want to call them. You've criticized this publicly, suggesting that their end goal is just financialization. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but do you think most of these so-called meme coins by the celebrities are kind of like a just get rich quick scheme?
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, like, I'm definitely not against people trying to have fun, and I'm not against people trying to make money, right? Like, that's, I think a lot of these, like, meme coin proponents that hold lots of coins themselves, they sometimes try to, like, say that I'm this, like, very Puritan person that, like, wants everybody to be forced to live in a monastery or whatever. And that's, like, totally not it, right? So I think, from, like... The reason why I'm worried about this wave is, like, I think of it as basically being like Star Wars episodes 7 to 9, right? Have you watched Star Wars episode 7 to 9?
I've seen all episodes.
Okay, but, like, do you agree with my view that, like, episodes 7 to 9, like, like, it's better to just think they never happened?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So,
just
like,
retcon.
like, it's basically, like, it's like social capital consumption, right? Like, basically, you have Star Wars, and, like, episodes 4 to 6 are, like, super brilliant, and it bought up a lot of goodwill with fans that, like, really turned it into a household name. And they, like, have this asset, this kind of virtual asset of, like, a lot of people's respect for the franchise, but, they don't have the people who originally made Star Wars great, and they weren't, like, really able to find successors, and so they just, like, did the thing that makes sense for a capitalist to do. It's like, I have an illiquid asset. I want to turn it into a liquid asset. And, like, how do I do this? I released a movie equivalent of a shitcoin, right? And, like, I've released this movie, and, like, okay, it's a piece of garbage. And, like, we don't really care too much about it. But, there are people who are going to watch it. And, like, people's respect for Star Wars as a franchise is going to drop. But, like, that's fine. That's, like, an illiquid asset. The whole point is that we're turning it into dollars, right? So I kind of view a lot of the kind of dark side of the meme coin activity as being, like, basically the same thing, right? It's like a pattern of, like, just like how things like capitalism intersect with human psychology, right? And it happens in movies, it happens in the crypto space, it happens everywhere, right? So it's what I think I want to see out of like the whole meme coin space, right, is like, I want to see things that are actually fun, right? And I want to see things that like are actually sustainable, right? This is the other thing, right? That a lot of these projects, like, I can confidently say they're basically not going to have any money in a year, right? And I think what's interesting is, like, there actually are meme coins that have survived and, like, they maintained a lot of value for a decade, right? Like, even Dogecoin, like, like Dogecoin, whatever you say about it, it's not a pump and dump. It's, there's a really big community there. It's still going strong. So I want to see things that are sustainable, and I think like Dogecoin is kind of like the Bitcoin of meme coins. Like, it's got this unique staying power, but because it's the first one. But I think for other things to survive for a long time, like, they really need to reinvent themselves, right? Like, one of the big challenges that a lot of these projects have is that they really front load the exciting parts. Like, when they launch, they basically say, okay, this is the beginning part, this is everyone's opportunity to get rich, this is everyone's opportunity to be part of the project, and then 3 or 4 years later, there just isn't that much to do, and you just have this kind of, like, fixed thing, and no one has the incentive to really continue it. And so that's why they just keep getting taken over by newer ones, right? And what I want to see more of is projects where they, like, actually have some kind of model for, like, even if the thing is 5 years old or 10 years old, like, some way to create an incentive for people to, like, really come in and renew it, right? Like, actually, like, the whole point of this is that, we're building these like mechanisms that try to experiment with incentives in different ways, and, like, create ecosystems that like, have some elements of capitalism, but it's like a very different kind of capitalism, right? And, like, actually try to like, be more sustainable and, like, really work better. And I want to see people try to, like, do more of that. And my ideal goal is to try to have things that are like very positive sum in the sense that they're fun for the participants and benefit the world. And like, there's lots of ways to benefit the world, right? Like you can donate, like 20% of the supply of your token to, global public health. And like, you could even turn that into a really fun thing and say, the World Health Organization sucks. And like, there's definitely lots of people who have complaints about it. And, we're going to go and work and make a better one. So that's one approach. Another approach is that you actually try to like take it as an opportunity to like use some of these technologies and like really bring them to a lot of to more maturity, right? So like I talk about like what I talked about zero knowledge proofs, for example, right? Like it's like if this stuff becomes mainstream, like I really think that like you could solve a lot of the debates that we have on the internet around like preserving privacy, and like at the same time making sure that like the people who you're talking to are actually people, and like at the same time making sure that you're seeing trustworthy content and so forth, right? But in order for those technologies to actually get there, like they need that that kind of early ecosystem to really get off the ground, and so like you could try to be that, right? So I think that's what I really want to see out of crypto projects, right? Basically, like things that are actually interesting, things that last, and things that have that like aspect where they're both like really positive sum toward the outside world, and that they're fun and interesting to the participants. And I think unfortunately, like there's definitely a subset of the like meme coin space that is like 0 out of 3 on that. So, I mean, it's a permissionless ecosystem, and like you can go and do the meme coin if you want, but like I definitely want to see more other things.
Then on to social media. I think at some point you said, maybe you wrote that you're leaving X/Twitter, X probably we can call it now. But in general, do you see, what are the negatives and positives you see on social media?
One of the ways I've heard Twitter be described is that it's the world water cooler, right? It's like basically this really crazy, like digital room where like all kinds of people, and like including all kinds of people who really hate each other, right? Including yourself, including like Margarita Simonyan, and like all of the people that, including like people from the government of Iran, including like mega people, including communists, including liberals, like everyone, right? And people who just have very incompatible perspectives, and they just all talk, basically yell at each other, right? And the question is like like is this even actually productive, right? And there's this like viewpoint that I think some people have where it's like, oh, like the thing that we need to bring humanity to peace is that we just need to talk to each other more, right? And I think, we've kind of seen how that's at least not true, or at least like not true in like that very naive way, right? Because like if you put people who hate each other distance one away from each other, and like you have this, like one big room with 100 million people shouting, then like that's not what people's incentive is, right? People don't just like hear the opposing side and think like, that's a good argument, right? People like hear that opposing side and they think, oh wow, these people are saying like hateful things that I cannot imagine a good person saying, and like, look, this person said this other horrible thing that's even more proof that they're horrible, and like, you actually have like even more division, right? And I think the other challenge is like, when you have these very opposing groups that are focused on fighting, and that are focused on kind of constantly trying to like push their viewpoint at the expense of other viewpoints, they don't even have time to do the work of like actually trying to refine their own viewpoints and make it better, right? It's like, it's the same as with countries, right? Like if you have a country that's, like constantly trying to go off and, like fight wars, it's going to end up, like neglecting the infrastructure and healthcare and the economy, right? So that's like, I think if we for a healthier internet, like, I actually don't think that this approach of like, let's have one water cooler and let's like put the right people in charge of the water cooler is even going to work at all, right? I think, like, I definitely think there's things you can do to make a water cooler better, right? But at the end, I think like, we need something that really creates space for a lot more diversity, and that like really creates space for like these deeper conversations where, you know, like both within individual groups, but also like communication between the different groups of the productive type can happen, right? And like that happens, I think, a lot. That happened a lot in the early internet era where you had forums. I mean, I think, you know, it's happening here now. Like, it happens much more easily in long form, right? But like, it definitely doesn't happen on a world water cooler. So this is like one of the reasons why I'm really interested in you know, like supporting the alternative social media landscape, right? Which is that you know, we have all of these like I want to actually like get to a world where we have a lot of these different social media platforms, and then like they can actually like both like appeal to different groups of people, but also like when you have competition between different social platforms, then like I think they actually end up competing more on the basis of quality, right? Whereas if you have competition between people within one social media platform, then they're basically just like competing to shout louder than the other side. So I want to see that. I also think that there are some like specific ideas for how to improve social media platforms that are really worth thinking about, right? So like about a year ago, I wrote this review of Community Notes, right? This was this platform that got kind of added into Twitter a couple of years ago. And like what Community Notes does, right, is it basically like lets people make like suggest annotations on tweets, like basically saying like, you know, here's some extra context, or like here's one piece that's actually incorrect, and here's a source like showing what the correct thing is. And if there is like some particular annotation that gets like wide agreement from people who often disagree with each other on other things, then like that note gets shown on top of the tweet, right? Like, I think people who have used Twitter for a long time, like they've probably seen notes before, right? And to me, what interests me about Community Notes is that like one is like it's actually doing this kind of experimentation with like new kinds of democracy, right? Because like traditional democracy is kind of one person, one vote, right? And here we're not just saying whoever has more votes can just shout louder than the other side, right? We're basically saying, actually, if you can get votes from people who normally don't agree with each other, then that actually counts for more than votes from people that are all part of the same echo chamber. And you know, like they actually tried to do this, and like you know, empirically it does seem to like actually like it seems to work actually surprisingly well for something that's like so like community driven, right? And I mean, it's definitely far from perfect, right? And it's you know, there's definitely been some good critiques that like it's not fast enough, and they've tried to improve on that. But I, like the thing that I respect about it is that it's like it's actually trying to solve this problem of like, let's create social media that like intentionally tries to show people correct information and like show people things that would be really valuable for them to hear, instead of just like showing them stuff that's like said by people who shout the loudest. But it does that in a way that doesn't rely on like empowering one group of people to kind of decide what's good and what's bad on behalf of everyone, right? Like I think like that's the thing that people you know, like really hated out of the old Twitter, right? And that's like basically what gave you know, like Elon his support base, right? That there's this you know, like there's this particular group that has these particular viewpoints, and you know, like I agree with a lot of them, I also disagree with some of them, and but at the same time it's like pushing this one perspective, and like that one perspective gets reflected in who not even, like, first of all, just who gets banned and who gets not banned, but also in, you know, who gets like shadow banned and deboosted and boosted and like all of these subtle things, and who gets you know, who gets blue check marks, who doesn't, right? And like if like Twitter is super important social infrastructure, right? And like if a government was working in that way, then like I think everyone would just say like, no, this is a totally unaccountable authoritarian dictatorship. I don't stand for it, right? And like what Community Notes said, it basically says is like, it's actually an open source algorithm, right? Like you can actually go run it yourself, and like it's actually based on, like this. Like based on contributions from like people where anyone can participate in it, but like at the same time, it's like this new version of democracy that actually like tries harder to be kind of favor quality in various ways, right? And like the thing that I did in my blog post is like I actually downloaded and I ran the source code myself, and like I actually went and verified. Like basically, what happened was that there was this community note that popped up on a site or on a tweet that was basically like say I'm trying to remember. It was I think it was some Chinese government account that was like talking about how the Chinese, like either the Chinese government respecting Muslims or something like that. And then there was a community note that basically said like, hey, like look at what's happening in Shin Jang. And then what happened is that note came up and then that note disappeared. And there were people basically saying like, hey, did Elon take off that note? Like what the heck happened? And like I was able to run the source code and I was able to like basically dig in to like the details of the algorithm and see like this is what happened. And like basically a lot of people, all that happened is that a lot of people voted for it, and then some people like voted against it, and like it just got taken down because like its score just kind of just ended up falling below what it was originally, right? That there was just like people who maybe thought it was too polarizing or something. And like you can disagree with those people, and like you could still say, oh well, what if like there were just like 100,000 fake accounts, or like there was other kinds of manipulation, but like it actually has that kind of accountability property that we like actually expect out of like out of our democracies, right? So that's I think the thing that I respect about it. And actually there was this interesting news yesterday, which is that YouTube announced that it's deploying basically the same algorithm. So I definitely don't think that community notes is kind of the end of the story here, right? So like one other thing that I follow a lot is prediction markets. So prediction markets basically say like you can basically bet whether or not some particular event is going to happen. And you might ask like, what's the point of this? Like, okay, fine, you can bet on things. We already have sports betting, but the reason why we've like a lot of intellectuals have been interested in prediction markets for a couple of decades is basically that like if you have this market where people can bet on whether or not some event in the future will happen, then like that actually lets you surface much more high quality information in terms of like people's predictions of the future, right? So you have like Trump versus Biden in the US, and then you have that news about like Trump getting convicted in that case, and then there's this question you might have of like, is this actually the end of Trump's case, or is it basically a nothing burger? Is it somewhere in between? And like you could actually go on the prediction markets and you could check, and like his chance of winning decreased from, I think it was like 54% to like about 50%. So it's and one of the things that I think is also good about prediction markets is like I think they can actually solve the speed problem, because so like with community notes, right? Like the biggest criticism of them is basically that like, okay, they give good notes, but they give good notes eventually, right? And by the time they give a note, there's like a whole bunch of like millions of people that have already seen a bunch of content, and they've probably already formed their views about like whether it's like some super contentious like international political issue like involving a war or a bombing or whatever, and like they've already formed that view, and then they just never end up seeing the correction, right? And with prediction markets, like actually it's like, well, if like some new piece of information comes along, then the first person who incorporates that information and who like basically makes a bet based on that new information, if that bet is correct, like that's the person that really gets the biggest reward, right? And so there's an opportunity, I think, to like really make things that are more like prediction markets, where you actually like give people incentives to try to push not just give like correct opinions on things, but actually like give correct opinions and do that and like optimize for doing that extremely quickly. And like I think in 2024, I mean, like things like Polymarket, they've taken off, and like I've personally noticed that prediction markets have taken off, not just in terms of like people being interested in betting on them, but also in terms of like people actually pointing to them and saying like, look, you know, like this is what people think is the probability of something like this happening, right? So, you know, like one, I mean, example relevance to you might be that. You know, there's always people who say that, like, oh, you know, if like the US or Europe help Ukraine a little more, then Putin is going to go launch all the nukes, and therefore, like, no one should go and help Ukraine, right? And like, you could actually go to these prediction markets, you could see, like, you know, like, what do they think is the probability that like some nuclear incident will happen? And it's like some tiny number. It's like 5%, right? Actually, yeah. On one of them, it ended up being like 7%, and I thought it was high, and I bet against it. And I think I converted like $500 into $560 that way. So it's like, you know, if you believe something crazy, then like, you know, here, like, please bet on it, right? If you're not willing to bet on it, like, do you actually take it seriously? What's interesting is that I think even Community Notes itself, like they've been starting to incorporate a few mechanics that are kind of a little bit prediction markety, right? In that they basically say that like if you participate in, like if you make a vote on a note and then that vote ends up like, you know, like consistently, like matching the final outcome, then like you get considered more trustworthy and like your score gets counted for more, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think like basically there's this, you know, like really fascinating space of these technologies, and I really want to see them like really thrive more, and I think they can really help make our internet more truth-seeking.
Very interesting. I mean, I've been talking quite a bit about community nodes, and these prediction markets are very interesting. So briefly about AI. There has been some gloomy predictions from several people, maybe even including you, about AI and how it could eventually even destroy, I don't know, humanity or do a lot of destruction. So what is your take on this, and what do you see as the biggest threats when it comes to AI?
Yeah, and so I think like first of all, like it's important to remember, right, that like technology is like in general really, really good, right? And like this is something that you can just see if you look at like just about any kind of measurable chart of any statistic, right? Like if you look at life expectancy, right? You know, like 100 years ago, I mean, like even in Europe, like most people lived to like age 30 or 40, and medicine just kept on getting better and better, and like now people lived like 80 years old, right? And, you know, if you look at, you know, the level of comfort that people have in their lives, if you look at the amount of time that people have for like leisure time, you know, like even just the facts that like, you know, washing your clothes is something that takes like 5 minutes of your attention instead of like 2 hours. Like that alone is like huge for like, you know, like women's empowerment, for example, right? And, so, like on average, you know, like sometimes people say like, oh, technology is good, but what about all the wars? But then you look at the stats and then you realize that like, no, like even if you include the wars, like actually, like all of these, you know, like, you know, like things keep on going up, right? And you know, like our lives are much better than the lives of our grandparents and or our great grandparents, right? And so I think you know, like there's definitely, a lot of like this is just something that's really important to remember, right? But at the same time, I think AI does have this like very unique property about it that makes it, I think, kind of uniquely worth worrying about, right? And that property is basically that like we're not talking about is like if AI becomes super intelligent, right? So like we're not talking about today's LLMs. If AI becomes super intelligent, we're not talking about creating a new tool. We're talking about creating a new form of life, right? It's like you know, if like for a monkey, right? If you give you know, a monkey a rock, like monkeys can do things with that rock. If you give a monkey an iPhone, like maybe there's some small chance that they might even be able to like figure out like one useful thing to do with the iPhone, right? But if you give a monkey a human, then you know, like actually you know, it's the human that's on top, right? And I think with AIs, there's a big risk that we're going to get something very similar, right? Basically, if you just ask the question like, okay, like if we create a new form of life, then like, will that new form of life have an incentive to like actually care about us, right? And like by default, like if you look at how humans have treated animals, the answer is no, right? And now you might say, oh, well, we'll program the AIs to be good, right? But the challenge is like programming AIs to be good is like super hard, right? So like evolution, programmed humanity to wants to have children, and then, we have some desires that correlate with having children, but then at some point, we invented like 5 different forms of birth control, and then, like we end up like wanting, like things that no longer connects to having children, and fertility rates in like South Korea are down to 0.7 now, right? So the worry is basically that, like if an AI is like much more sophisticated than like even our ability to set goals for it, then like the AI is going to sort of, like break out of the box in the same way that we broke out of, like evolution's box of like wanting to push us to have as many children as possible. So I think this is a very valid worry, right? And now I think at the same time, like there are good, like theoretical arguments, right, for why, like any one of these theoretical frames can easily, just end up being totally incorrect, right? Because, like one of the things that people said about AIs like 5 years ago is basically, oh, AIs are going to be, like if AIs have a goal, then they're going to optimize toward that goal. And like if you optimize toward that goal, then like there's always some way to optimize toward that goal that just like isn't what we actually had in mind, and it leads to a very bad outcome, right? It's like it's basically the same as like some of those Greek fables, right, where someone King Midas wants wants to get richer, and so he says, hey, like I want everything I touch to turn to gold, and then of course he ends up dying of starvation for the obvious reason, right? And so like with AIs, it's like you tell an AI cure cancer, and the AI realize like, wait, the fastest path to having a world with 0 cancer is just having a world with 0 humans, right? And like those kinds of arguments. But then you fast forward 5 years, and then you think like you just like actually play with actually existing AIs, and then you realize like, wait, actually, AIs understand common sense now. And like the more powerful the AIs are, the better they are at understanding common sense, right? And so like that kind of argument that like if you tell an AI to cure cancer, it's going to cure cancer by trying to literally kill everyone, like it seemed plausible back when we had AIs like AlphaGo and AlphaZero, where they were like entirely designed around this paradigm of like optimizing for an objective. But these days, like they don't work that way at all, right? So I think it's like this is one of those spaces where there's just like a really huge unknown, right? Like we are in the process of birthing superintelligence, right? And superintelligence is like fundamentally a very powerful thing. And if it goes wrong, then, like we're not going to be able to press the off switch, right? And I mean, even aside from kind of the possibility of like a superintelligence doing something fully autonomously, I mean, you could even like think of shorter term stuff, right? Like think about like just autonomous, like police and warfare, right? Like imagine just a dictator does not need an army anymore, right? And like one of the constraints on dictators historically has been that like eventually if they do things that are too horrible, their own people start turning against them, right? But with AIs, like basically, if your soldiers are robots, then like they're not going to do that, or at least, they're the possibility of them doing that is like completely disconnected from, like whether you do kind of okay things or horrible things, right? And so there just is this ability for like humanity to get into these traps where we just can't get out, right? Like, there's this Chinese proverb, 天高皇帝远, which means the sky is high, the emperor is far away. And it basically is like this proverb that talks about basically the limits of centralized power, right? It's like, even if you have a very powerful, like government or some other kind of powerful force, like there's limits to its attention. And there's always things that happen outside of its attention, right? But AI, no, it has unlimited power and unlimited attention. And there's just like a lot of these things that I think are really like there's just a lot of different directions that I think actually are worth worrying. Now then there's the question of like, well, okay, we can worry, but like what do we actually do about the worrying, right? And I mean, I think like the first thing that I would say, right, is that it's like I definitely hope that like we don't actually get like people rushing toward like creating these like Sam Altman like $7 trillion AI farms, right? Like I think we can afford AIs to like super intelligent AI to come 5 years later instead of coming 5 years sooner, right? Like I think like in general for most technologies I'm like very pro accelerating, right? It's like self-driving cars, like okay, fine, if you rush self-driving cars, like they might kill people, like 50 people in accidents this year, but like the reality is that like humans kill like 50,000 people in accidents every year, and so if self-driving cars come that are really good come even a month sooner, then it's worth it, right? And like that's how I think about most technologies, but like AI is just like it's just on another level, right? And that's something. And so I think it's like first of all, I just I definitely want people to like not rush towards developing it, and I definitely want people to also really focus on like this science of like basically actually being able to create AIs that like actually give us like that like actually do what we want instead of just going off and doing random things, right? So this is a thing that we call AI alignment. And there's also like AI interpretability, so like being able to actually understand what's going on inside of an AI. So there's a lot of really valuable work there, right? And then another thing that I want to see more of is like the thing that I think I'm the most worried about is like AI that tries to like really maximize for being autonomous, right? And like I think in a lot of ways that's something that like a lot of people are really scared of, right? Because like if even if we just go back to like much more regular fears, right? If you're an artist, then the good thing for you would be an AI that like does like 90% of your artwork, and so you can level up from like basically like drawing pictures to like making entire movies, right? And like that's something that would be really good for you. The thing that would be bad for you is if we just have AIs that just like fully autonomously, like make pictures on their own, and then 10 years later they just fully autonomously make movies on their own, right? And what I want to see more of is I want to see like AI products that actually take this path of like keeping users in control and giving users and like basically where you have like this really fast like tight feedback loop between like what is the thing that I want, AI creates like something, and then a person says no I want this, and then AI adjusts it a little bit, right? And then if we have like an approach to using AI that looks more like that, then I think like a lot of these risks end up getting reduced, right? Because like the more the human is kept in the loop, and the more that we like advance the technologies that involve keeping the human in the loop, the less there are these risks that are associated with like basically just these completely independent super intelligences that we just like already train to be able to like execute really complex plans that then end up like doing completely crazy things, right? So I definitely think there's a good future. I think there's like also not even just one future, but like a couple of different futures that's really worth being worried about. And at the same time, like I definitely one of those futures to be worried about, I think, is also just a future where the idea that AI is dangerous gets used as a way to justify like all AI being completely closed, and then like basically everything being controlled by a couple of companies out of Silicon Valley. Like that's a risk too, right? So I definitely like I think there is a really strong opportunity for a very positive future with AI, just in terms of how massively it can improve our productivity, improve our ability to do science, improve our ability to learn and understand things. But this is something that, like, it's a future that we need to like actively go out and seek, I think.
Okay. Let's move on a little bit. Different topics. You already mentioned Ukraine. You already mentioned Simonian.
Yes.
After the Kremlin launched their invasion against Ukraine in 2022, you very quickly condemned the attack and sided with the defender, which is Ukraine, even telling their master propagandist Simonian to go fuck themselves. How was this kind of, I think... how was this received by your fans and peers in general? It was a pretty strong statement coming from you.
Yeah, I think at the time people definitely received it positively. I think, definitely, people who remembered back when I, visited Russia before a few times before COVID, even ended up meeting, Vladimir Putin briefly. And, I definitely felt like I had a need to just, make it very clear how I feel about the whole situation. So I definitely know that people were grateful. There's definitely people who are of the mindset that I should not be getting involved in politics, and I should be neutral, and generally I think I do think it's possible to kind of overdo taking sides, right? And I do think there is there definitely is a problem with certain kinds of Western activists where they try to say that climate change and income inequality and health and global justice and all these things are actually the same problem, right? And that's just obviously false, right? Because I think that kind of mentality, I think it one, it actually ends up obscuring actually important trade-offs, right? So one of them, for example, is organic farming, right? Is actually better for health, but it's actually worse for land use because it means organic farming is less efficient, and so it means that a big portion of the land has to be converted into being agricultural land instead of just being able to just be left alone as forests, right? And so sometimes you do have actual trade-offs between things that people agree are beautiful and good, and you have to be able to discuss that. And then of course the other problem is if you start being political on everything, then the set of people that you haven't completely alienated just keeps on shrinking, and then it just becomes yourself. And then actually at some point, you inevitably end up changing your mind and you end up saying things that would have completely alienated the version of yourself of even 1 year ago, right? But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that crypto is not about just trying gambling on coins and getting rich, right? And it is I think an inheritor to this cypherpunk tradition that was about using open technologies to improve people's freedom, right? And to create a world that is more democratic and a world where everyone can feel comfortable participating on the same level, right? And then if you just go back a bit to those underlying values, and then you ask the question of is Putin killing tens of thousands of people in Mariupol against those values, or kind of something that's oh no, totally perpendicular, totally neutral to those values? Well, no, it's completely against, right? And I think sometimes when crypto gets criticized for this focus on financialization, there's a lot of the time what happens is that basically I think people do kind of forget the principles, right? And there's this kind of desire to get as many users as possible, which is not just a crypto thing, right? Every company in every industry has sacrificed principles in order to get users, at least to some extent. Well, not every company, but definitely companies in every industry, right? To some extent. But I think it's worth having these constant reminders that when we use things like openness and decentralization as slogans, they're not just slogans, they're words that actually mean things, right? And they're words that actually talk about what kind of future that we wants to see, right? And I think preserving just people's right to first of all, just not have their lives completely destroyed by bombs, but also actually choose their political destiny, and be able to express like things that they wants to say, and like not get like censored by a dictator and all of these things. Like that's all actually part of that, right? And I think like if we have like someone who's actually like basically trying to basically spent 2 decades like turning Russia into this place where it's like very difficult to say anything politically, and then like not just that, but then trying to like actually expands the borders of that by force. Like that's just something that I think everyone just needs to come together to oppose.
Agree fully. 100%. You also made a large donation in crypto to charities run by the Ukrainian government. How much did you follow the war in general during the first months, and what about now? Like, are you still?
Yeah, I mean, definitely following closely in the first months, and definitely still following, definitely still actively, like trying to identify any opportunities where I can be helpful. And definitely, staying in touch with our, Ukrainian crypto community. It's like actually a very amazing community, by the way. You have, there's things like Near Protocol. There's companies, like Raremo that's been doing some ZK voting. So like using, the zero knowledge proof technology that I talked about to do like more secure and like privacy preserving internet voting. There's just a couple of Ethereum Foundation people, like lots of projects, like have some Ukrainian developers, like some inside Ukraine, some outside. I think there's a really like amazing and beautiful collection of people there. So I think I definitely wants to like support Ukraine as a whole, and also just like our own Ukrainian community, because I think they've just like they've contributed so much to us, and so I know they like have so much more that they can contribute to the world in general.
I think it's amazing that even at the midst of the war, they're still innovating and coming up with new stuff.
Yes.
I think in Ukraine in general, they've been like digitalization has been ongoing really quickly after.
Yes, it has.
So, for example, they don't use that much cash anymore. Everything is paid with mobile phones and so on. So, which of course probably maybe better reduces corruption and this kind of.
So I think it's. Eastern Europe I think has this like really strong tradition of this, right? Like Estonia, did a lot around e-voting. They did a lot around this e-residency program, and they did a lot of like that kind of really fascinating experimentation in the 2010s. I remember visiting Estonia, and like the government felt like a startup, right? Like it felt really impressive, and it does feel like Ukraine is really continuing inside of that same spirit. So I think that's absolutely amazing. And I think this question of like how to make like not government infrastructure in countries something that's like more adapted to the digital era is a super important one. And I think like there's definitely lots of really amazing work that's being done there.
Okay, final question. Is crypto still playing a part in Ukraine's war against Russia, or in general in Ukraine? Is it still...
So the things that I know about are that it definitely still gets used for like people earning salaries and like people like making donations and making investments and like those kinds of really basic activities. It was super helpful at the beginning of the war, right? Because a lot of the kind of traditional financial systems just totally did not work, and that situation is definitely better to some extent now. But people are still using it for that. I know there are these like donations for some of these like Ukrainian charities. There's the government-funded groups, but then there's also all of the independent ones, right? So there's there's Come Back Alive, and then like there was Ukraine DAO, and then Ukraine DAO ended up spinning down over about a few months ago. Actually, I think that was an interesting case study of like the value of crypto, right? And like talking about, like reducing corruption, right? Because Alona, who runs Ukraine DAO, like she did get accused of doing like basically, like stealing the money and spending it on herself. And she was able to just like go and point to like, here are all of the transactions that we did, and here is the purpose of each one, and like basically, like prove her innocence. So I thought that was like a really good case study of how like blockchains can really improve transparency for like those kinds of like public organizations. There's I definitely see some of those charities continuing to collect money. I mean, I think like at this point, of course. One of the I think one of the challenges in like thinking about this question, right, is that there's government, like there are all of these like Western aid programs that are giving like very significant amounts of money, like definitely like larger than anything the crypto space can provide, right? Which I think is good, right? But I think it's the question I think the crypto space needs to ask is like, what is the point of highest leverage that it has? And I think there are actually points of high leverage, right? Like there definitely are a lot of like individual companies and individual projects there, and like I hear about this from lots of both Ukrainians and people visiting Ukraine that I talk to, that there are lots of individual projects that would actually benefit from like even relatively small amounts of money coming in. But, there's, we just have to do this like extra level of hard work in actually trying to identify them. So I think that's really, there's definitely an opportunity to help for people who are willing to put that extra effort in. One other thing I think is that, kind of getting back to, the kind of cypherpunk roots of crypto, right? There's, so one of the applications that's I thought is really interesting is, so this was technology that was developed by this company based in Kiev called Raramo. It's called Freedom Tool. Like, basically, what their first use case, it's kind of fun. It's basically, if you're a Russian, then you can prove, like, zero knowledge proof with a Russian passport that you are Russian, and then you can vote. Right. And like the point is to basically say, like if we have this digital election that's like completely independent of, like Vladimir Putin's ability to like, like fully manipulate the results, which he's been doing since like at least, like 2011, then like let's see what the results actually are. Right. And like I think it's like, like that really, like it really uses the technology and like all of the different ways that fit it together, right? Because like votes, go on the blockchain, and that ensures that whoever's running the vote can't censor the votes. Then you have zero knowledge proofs to protect the voter's privacy, but then at the same time prove that the voter, like actually is like basically like one vote per citizen. And like it's basically all done without the permission of the Russian government, obviously, right? And I mean, this is the sort of thing that I think is interesting, right? Because I think if we ask the question, if you want to ask the question of like, how do we, like help? I mean, could be Russia. I mean, Belarus also. I mean, like any of these, like post-Soviet countries that are unfortunately, like stuck under the dictator. Like, how do we actually help them get out at some point? Then. Like the place where you have to start is like basically, like give people an ability to express their political voice in a way that's like actually independent of like the censorship and like the government like going after you for like saying the tiniest political thing and putting you in jail for a year, right? And I think. I mean, this stuff is like real, like that stuff is really early, but I mean, I think it's interesting, right? I think it's like there, especially if you start kind of going full circle, right, and like taking the technology outside of finance and basically saying like, can we have like privacy preserving voting? Can we have like political discussions where you can participate in such a way that you preserve your privacy, but like at the same time prove that you're like an actual person and like not like 10,000 accounts controlled by a bot? Then I mean, I think they're like I think this is like one of those things that needs to be tried.
When is it? When is all this technology? When can we use it for good?
Well, exactly. So I think this is the thing, right? It's coming, right? And it's coming. I think it's coming very soon. The reason is that for a long time, basically, I think the reason why the only thing you'd hear about people using blockchains for is gambling is because scalability was very limited and transaction fees were super high, right? You would literally cost $50 to send a transaction on Bitcoin back in 2017. And then in 2021, Ethereum basically went the same way, right? And so what happens now is a lot of the work on scalability, a lot of the work on cutting down the fees, improving user experience, all of those questions, it's actually happening, right? And we've actually gotten to the point where there are applications that are blockchain based, but where the user experience just feels like the same quality as a centralized platform, right? So there's a decentralized social media project called Farcaster. It's one of these alternative Twitters, right? And what's interesting about Farcaster is they use a combination of the Ethereum blockchain and their own decentralized network in order to store messages and information about things like user accounts. And the benefit of this is that you can basically have multiple clients, multiple pieces of software that can all view the same content, right? So if you want to build your own application that's part of the Farcaster network, you can do that, and then you can make posts and you can see posts, and you can have things work your own way but still be part of this bigger ecosystem. And but then if you look at just how the app feels just in terms of the user experience, you don't have to know anything about blockchains to use Farcaster, right? So it's really getting there. And I think it's we're just now getting to really that point where we can actually start not just focusing on the theory, but actually really focusing hard on the applications. And I expect we're going to start doing a lot more of that.
Okay, that's a good time to end the conversation. Thank you, Vitalik.
Yes,
it was
thank
fantastic.
you too, Pekka.